Hello, everyone. This is Bite and Play. Today we have a special treat for you all. I'm joined by Denis Dyack, who is legendary in the world of vampires and games. He is associated with both the Legacy of Kain franchise and is now working on Deadhaus Sonata, which you can see just behind him over there. For those of you that are joining for the first time, Bite and Play is all about the world of video game vampires and everything it takes to build them, create them, make them, if you will, and how to survive as a vampire hunter in that particular world. Denis, I'm so excited to speak to you today. You are part of one of the more legendary vampire franchises when it comes to video games. And so today
Thank you.
I want to talk about both games, but we're going to start with the Legacy of Kain franchise. Before we jump into that, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your history in the video games. I think you have 30 plus years.
Oh, I do. I've been in a long time. Yeah. So, well, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. It's the first time I've ever been on a vampire dedicated podcast and discussion. So I do want to add, I've had vampires in many of my games, going back as far as Dark Legions, which was a title before I created Legacy of Kain. And then also in Eternal Darkness, we also had a vampire in there. I wrote a blog on that, a kind of a fun blog, how I like putting vampires in wherever I can. And of course, now we're working on a game called Deadhaus Sonata, where you play the undead fighting the living. So we have many classes, but a vampire class is one of the classes in Deadhaus. But just to give everyone a background on me, I've been doing video games for a very long time. I've been in it for over 30 years. My background is in computer science. Some don't know this, but I've got a master's degree in comp sci where I did a deep dive into neural networks and artificial intelligence. So I've been doing that for a super long time, but I'm known for writing. When it came to creating Legacy of Kain and the original game, we worked on that for quite a while. We were super excited about it, wanted to do something different. But in each case, when we create a game, I always try to do something entirely different, not only from a narrative perspective, but also from, I would say, a world building construction perspective, which we can talk about all today. So it should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to start with Legacy of Kain because we can't cover all of the games. But
No.
I'm just kind of curious, where did the idea for that game come about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Back in the day, the original concept was around 1992, maybe a bit earlier. I used to love playing RPG games, and all of the RPG games that I had played pretty much came out of Japan, especially on consoles. You couldn't make a console RPG, and if you weren't in Japan and if you tried to, shop one, which we did, we had so many people tell us, no, you've got to be Japanese too. Only the Japanese know how to do this. And the problem that I saw with the Japanese RPGs, I really like them, don't get me wrong, but I was an avid reader and I hated reading all this text on screen. And when we started thinking about what we wanted to do, you'll find this with me a lot. And any kind of common tropes in video games, anything that's kind of the same old, I really fight against. I find that not enough, even back then, but especially today, not a lot of groups try to do something that's truly innovative because it's very risky. It's very hard. And so when we started thinking about Legacy of Kain, we started thinking about, let's do this RPG, which we had never done before. We did sort of real-time strategy games before. And for Dark Legions, the previous title where we had a vampire in it, as I was just discussing earlier, we wrote these, I guess, playing cards for marketing. And we really enjoyed writing the stories for them so much. In fact, I was like, let's get out of the PC market. Let's go to consoles. Let's try this out and let's do this epic RPG. But the RPG we're going to do is going to be something that's totally different. No Save the Princess. As a matter of fact, we're going to create this character that the entire world hates and wants to kill him. And actually, you hate yourself and you don't like who you are, but you're the only one that can save the world. And then I pulled from various inspirations of Elric of Melbourne, of course, sort of for the look of Kain. Also, works like The Wheel of Time, movies like The Unforgiven, where all the characters were great because we wanted to write something that was truly different, where it wasn't easy to tell. No one was sort of a cardboard cutout. And that, and even The Pillars of the Earth was a book that my mother had. And I actually confess I didn't read the book, but the pillars, looking at that going, hey, we can have these pillars. They're going to be the foundation of this world we're going to work on. And so the concept was called The Pillars of Nosgoth. And you were to play a vampire. And the whole idea of the game is like, not everything is what it seemed. And what you would think would be sort of an Occam's razor approach of, I'm just going to kill these bandits that killed me to get revenge, quickly turns out to be not what's really happening. And we thought that would be something that gamers would really enjoy, a mature storyline, something very dark, very gothic. Of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula was a big inspiration as well. It was interesting back then because when we created it, We had so many people tell us that vampires were out, they were old, they would never be popular again. And I hear that with a lot of games we create. And I guess the message there is you just can't listen to what people say if you have a vision for something and you think it's the right vision. There's always going to be critics, and it's okay. And you should listen to the criticisms, take them to heart, and analyze if you think they're true. But at the end of the day, when it comes to creating something new and original, there is no path for that because it's never been done before. And then when we created something like Kain, where you're truly dark and you truly are the only person that can save the world, that back then was very, very different. Very different. So anyway, that's how I would round up all the inspiration. I know it's a long answer to that question, but that's the best I can do for that one. I hope it was all right.
No, I think that's great because I think periodically about the fact that in the early days, I felt like vampires were a very kind of one-sided. It's a dark creature. You have the good vampire hunters and they hunt vampires. And then over the years, we started to see a more complex vampire and a vampire that can struggle with his own nature and kind of play out a lot of philosophical issues there. And so it was really cool to see Kain be one of those early examples of a more complex vampire. That being said, his story and the story of the world unfolds over several games. Given that you had so many doubters, how far ahead were you thinking when you were creating Kain and his storyline?
Well, that's interesting. So I only created the original, the first one, and did not go on to do the others, of course. But there's two ways, and this changes from the first game to the others. And let me describe sort of when it comes to world building. There's sort of two schools of thought for world building. There's what I would say the traditional approach, which uses Aristotle's Poetics as a foundation with a 3-act narrative where you focus on characters. Characters in the game that you introduce have to really have a significant role, otherwise they shouldn't be there. And you see that with most movies. That is not the approach we took. The other approach is much more rare. It's a much harder path to follow, but the path that we like. You'll see this kind of world building. It's very Tolkien-esque. It's like Lord of the Rings, where you build this massive tapestry, where you have huge foundations. That's how I like to create all of the games that we work on, where we create this baseline of this world, and then we start telling stories within it. We did that for Legacy of Kain, for Eternal Darkness, for all the games, that I've done that are narrative based. And the idea is that you can tell multiple stories. So the answer to your question is we created this universe for tons and tons of narrative work and to be able to tell many, many stories. So if you look at the first game, there's a tremendous amount of world building. There's all kinds of detail. And if you go from that past, when you get into the Soul Reaver games and then the follow-ups, they use a lot of that world, but overall, there's not nearly as much world building, I would say. It's more on script line. It follows Aristotle's Poetics. There's a lot more focus on script and characters, where we tried to build everything from the ground up. So at the end of the day, I would say that there was huge potential, but we went on from Legacy of Kain to later go on to do Eternal Darkness, which, as I said earlier, similar foundations and similar ways to go. That's the best I could answer that one.
We're not looking for easy answers here. I'm curious, you mentioned that for you, Kain, he's a bad guy that's supposed to save the world. When you were designing this world and these characters, did you have an idea of like, these are good guys and these are bad guys? In your mind, who are the good guys and the bad guys?
Yeah, I know. I specifically didn't like that. And to be clear, there's a bunch of vampire tropes that are really hated. They're less nowadays, but back then they were huge. So let me start with that, and then I'll get to your question. We'll get there. I hated the whole idea that vampires would die in daylight. That was something that I think when they created Nosferatu, that's kind of like a Hollywood trope. It was never in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I also hated that vampires, they were super powerful, but they never used any weapons or they had very limited magic. And I'm like, why don't we create someone who's just like, he's a massive warrior. He can use axes and maces and swords and armor. And like, why wouldn't you do that? So yeah, you're super powerful, but why would you not? That's like saying I'm super powerful, but I don't want to use this really good weapon. We wanted to do that too. That was some of the things that we did that sort of really broke, I would say, a lot of narratives. It was really a god fantasy in some sense where you got really super powerful. So as I was talking about the construction of vampires and how they didn't use weapons, it was just so paper thin as a character. I was like, because if I was a vampire, I'd be using all these weapons. And then when you started thinking about plot lines in video games back then, they were all cookie cutter and all the characters were black and white. These people were good, these people were bad. And that's not a good reflection of reality. There are very few people in this world who think they are evil. Very few. They do things, they're motivated by things, they're trying for whatever their motivations are, they're doing the best they can to get through the world. And, I'm not saying there isn't true evil, because I think there is. But if you're going to write a story that's compelling, and you're going to write characters that are compelling, just like you're going to create a vampire that's going to use more than just his innate powers, he's going to use weapons and other things. You need to create characters that are multifaceted and have their own agendas that make sense, that the average person will be like, oh, I get that. I get why they're doing that. I might not agree with it, but at least I see their motivations. And certainly back then in the early days of video games, almost everything was black and white. Like, these people are evil, these people are good. If you're going to save the princess, here's the bad guys. And we literally wanted to create something that just threw all of that out. Really, really inspired by the movie Unforgiven. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. But if you look at the movie Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, all the characters are gray. They seem good at some points, really bad at others. But by the time you go through the whole story, they're fully developed characters in every way. And you even have Clint Eastwood going from what you think is useless to this guy who's kind of terrifying. And you understand that he tried to walk away from something, but in his own nature, it brings him back to this sort of terrifying killer that kills a lot of people. And right at the end, with Little Bill saying, I didn't deserve this, it's like, that doesn't matter. And it's these strategies and complexities when you're creating characters that really make games, in my opinion, a lot better and stand apart from what you see commonly, unfortunately, still in a lot of stories and video games.
On a side note, I completely agree with kind of the agitation around vampires hating sunlight, because if you look at a lot of the mythology, it kind of comes out of nowhere. There's a myth in Irish mythology about a vampire Abertach, and he would actually come back from the dead in the morning to come look for blood. I can sort of see where it's coming from, because light and darkness and all of that, but it doesn't have a lot of root in anything
Yeah.
that was written.
Yeah. I personally hate it. Like the latest movie, Nosferatu, I loved it. I'm a huge, vampire a fan of movies, but I think that's where that trope came from, because it was first done in the early Nosferatu movies. But yeah, it's not in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Vampires are traditionally weaker in the daylight. And if you check out Deadhaus Sonata, that's how the characters are. But they're certainly not like sunlight kills them. And there's a lot of games that do that. Yeah, I'm just not a big fan. You can like it, but for me, I hate it.
I'm in the same camp. I'm agitated by it because it doesn't logically come from anywhere for me. And it also kind of like breaks up a lot of things that don't seem natural. That being said, in the vampire world that you created, do you have kind of a special relationship to any particular vampire in that world? Is Kain your favorite, or is there a character that resonates with you personally?
Well, I guess I create a lot of original stuff. I always have been. I guess that's what I'm known for. And so Kain, Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, as an example, is kind of like a baby to me, and I love the whole world. Certainly Vorador, but all the characters in there, it was really fun developing them and creating them and sort of walking through and mapping out all of their machinations and how the story would go. I still remember sitting down, just drawing a map, which later became the map in Legacy of Kain when it was certainly more finished. But I just took a pencil and said, we're going to go here. We're going to go to this place here. Nutraptor's going to have this skull on the mountain. It's going to be really cool. He's totally insane. And just walking through why he's insane and how all this happened and what's going on with the pillars and what happened to the pillar balance. Why was she killed? All these kind of things. So I would say there's not really any favorites, but I do love them all. And I think there's some fun stuff there. I was reading recently a vampire book, and I think the first one's called Empire of the Vampire. And to my surprise, there was a quote from Legacy of Kain. And the quote in there shocked me when I read it. It was like, call your dogs and I'll feast upon their corpses. I was like, wow. Like, you're reading a book, because I just like vampire stuff. You read that and you see some of your work in there and you're just like, that is crazy. That's really cool. So I do think that, Blood Omen Legacy of Kain certainly had a big effect on video games, not only from the story and the plot line, but also I do believe we were one of the first, if not the first, to use professional voice actors in video games back then. And that was to get away from all that reading and text that I saw with all those Japanese RPGs. I really hated reading on a television screen. Monitors are much better now, but back then it was like, you'd go cross-eyed, right? It would be terrible. And so seeing that too was, it was pretty amazing. It was pretty fun. That only happened like a few months ago. I was just reading this book and I was like, what is this quote? That's so cool. It's a nice homage. You know what I mean?
That has to be an incredible moment. Did you just kind of see your world living on in other places? I'm curious, you mentioned you wanted to give Kain this ability to kind of wield weapons and actually want to wield weapons, right? That was missing in the past. So I kind of wanted to expand that and talk about fashion in general. How did you go about creating the idea of what they wore, what they wielded, what made sense for them? Where did that inspiration come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before I coined the role, I think I was one of the first in the industry back then too to call myself a director. The team was pretty small. I was the lead programmer, and I would be thinking about cool things we could do as a vampire. So when it came to things like gameplay, as an example, you just hit someone with a sword and blood would fly off. I was like, well, what if we had armor that would take in that blood? So you didn't actually have to suck in blood. And so we would slowly build upon those things. And then one of my best friend's brother was our art director. His name was Scott Colley. So I come up with these ideas in gameplay and I'd say, hey, Scott, okay, so this is what they're going to do. Can we do a cool drawing for it? He was an amazing artist. He's unfortunately passed away, but he really helped define the look of Kain. And we would just roll like that. It's the only way I describe it. When I make games, I believe in story. I believe in narrative. I believe in making sure that it's holistically, intertwined with gameplay. And you'll see a lot of games, especially with large teams these days. This is one of the reasons I think AAA is really failing. You'll have programmers go off in one direction and story writers go off in another direction, and they rarely talk. They come together at the end, and it's just a hodgepodge of things that don't make sense. Where with Legacy of Kain, every detail of the game design flowed into the story, and the story flowed into the art direction. It was just way of doing things that was really fun to do. And it made everything just feel right, is the only way I would describe it. So when you ask, how did you come up with these things? It was just sitting back and saying, well, if I was a vampire, I would want this. Just think about it this way. I'm a vampire. What kind of magic would I want? I want magic that's going to help me out in combat, which is sucking in blood. And then we do other things too, like, oh, let's have black blood for the undead. So you can't always just wear the suit armor that takes in blood all the time because you start taking damage, or poison blood, or all that kind of stuff. All of these things are done through trial and error of playing the game, not trial and error, but just experimentation. And again, another thing that I think we're really lacking today in video games is the people who are making them, how much are they playing their own game? Because the games get so large, believe it or not, you can complete a game without even playing it while you're working on it, because the teams can be 1,000 people. But that was not what was happening with Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. I was the lead programmer at the time. I was programming stuff. I was writing story. I was doing artwork, those bat fly-throughs. Everyone was doing everything. And that all helped and came into creating something holistic where you got the various armor types, the various weapons that hopefully made sense to everyone. And even when you look at, say, something like the Soul Reaver, when we created that weapon, I wanted something super powerful, but it couldn't be so powerful that you would never use another weapon. So the downside to that was you couldn't get any blood when you used it, right? And so it had its uses, but it wasn't the be all and end all for weapons. I think that only comes through playing your own game, thinking about the designs, going back with the art team back and forth. Yeah. So anyway, that was the history and how that happened.
So that's really cool. I'm going to ask another loaded question. It's a big world and it has its own history. Are there any unresolved paradoxes that you're aware of? I like the fact that you reference Wheel of Time because that's one of the things that naturally comes up. But are you aware of any unresolved paradoxes that you just kind of kept there and said, okay, we're going to just live with that?
There are a few, I would say, but what I would say more than anything else, there is a ton of story that we never explored that I had planned off in the future that I never told anybody. So as Crystal Dynamics went off and did their thing with the franchise, I went in a completely different direction. And so all the things that I had sort of thought about with sequels and things have never happened. There's so much potential in the world, but I don't know if that'll ever be told, at least the stuff that we created and that I was excited about. So it probably will remain a secret.
I have to ask that as a follow-up question, right? So the world did live on and basically became a franchise. What is your take on where it went? And how would you see that world evolving if you kept making Legacy of Kain games? Where did you see that world going?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that question. It's a good question. So what happened, they took another game and they made it into Legacy of Kain. The game was called Shifter. One of the designers who was working on Legacy of Kain with us in Canada, he came down and worked with us for a while. And he was talking about this other game he was going to work on after Legacy of Kain. And it turned out that they decided they're going to make that into a Legacy of Kain. Totally changed everything. It was just a different game. It was like, if you look at Soul Reaver and you compare it to Blood Omen, they're not even the same type of game. They're like a different genre. I think the narrative and script was excellent. There were some things that were really good about it, But in the end, when you're really starting to see that, the series is in rough shape now. I think there was a lot of retconning. I would say most of it relies upon the world building that we did in the original game. And so there's a lot of retconning over and over again, and a lot of different ideas being thrown in that don't have that holistic or similar approach that we did with the original game. I do think that there's some really cool things in it, but I think in the end, where you're especially starting to see it now, resolving that series is going to be pretty difficult. I would have taken it totally in a different direction. And I think on things at a much larger scale where, again, they're at Aristotle's Portex, 3-act narrative, all that kind of stuff. A lot of cliffhangers too. I really don't like to be continued. I hate that, actually. I like storylines to be completed. And with Legacy of Kain, we completed the story. And sure, there can be more told, but that story in itself was contained. So in the end, we would have done something very different. If you want to see how we would have done it or what I would have done something like it, Deadhaus Sonata is looking at the entire House of the Dead, and we're looking at various massive worlds and different things. That's kind of a direction that I like to take. But certainly for the Legacy of Kain stuff, that's always going to be untold. I think it'll remain a secret.
That is a cliffhanger that you said. That is a to be continued.
I guess.
What were some of the biggest lessons for you from that game? We often say building games about world building, and this is one of those games that really lived up to that moniker. You built a world. What did you learn? What were some of the mistakes? What would you have done differently now if you went back and redid it? And what were some of the biggest things you took away to next to you?
Yeah, geez, it's a tough question. I think, obviously the game was very successful. I would say one of the biggest lessons learned is, I feel anyway, the type of world building that we did with Legacy of Kain and say Eternal Darkness and Two Human and that sort of token-esque approach where you do a lot of research on the world and you build out the world first and then you start telling stories within it is the way to go. It's much harder. A lot of, I would say, video game productions can't do that. They can't afford it, or they can't afford to take the time, which is really sad. So I think that, to me, turned out to prove that that's definitely the superior model. I think that plays out in books, in every form of media, frankly. Because I could, whether it's like Malazan Book of the Fallen's a really good example of one of my favorite series of all time. I recommend it strongly. It's 10 books. They're huge, but very, very well worth reading. A really cool fantasy. Dark fantasy. So that's one of the lessons learned. I think a lot of people will push against that. A lot of people will say, no, you want to follow the 3-act narrative. And I think Amy Hennig did that very well. She told a story within those confines very well. She loved that stuff, but I've just never been a fan of it. To be clear, I'm not criticizing. I'm saying this is not my thing. I don't know. There's so many things you learn as you go. That was my 4th title at that point, and it was our first big hit. Learning how to deal with those issues better is another lots of life lessons there. But, as far as the creation of the game and the universe, I feel pretty happy, I would say, overall. I think it was pretty good.
You created a natural transition to Deadhaus Sonata. Well, you can see a little bit of that in this world. I did get a chance to start playing around, and I'm one of the early lucky few. But because others probably haven't seen the game or haven't played the game just yet, it'd be great if you could start out and tell a little bit about that world before I start prodding with some questions.
No, absolutely. Deadhaus Sonata is a combination of many of the games that I've made over time. It's certainly got some things that we learned from Legacy of Kain, Eternal Darkness, Two Human, Metal Gear Solid, all of those things. But it's more than anything else. If we were to try to evolve the medium, how would we do it? And what kind of world building would we do? All of the things that we talked about with Legacy of Kain, that was my first time doing something like that. So now that I've done it many times, what is the most optimal way, or what's the most interesting way, the most novel way we can do that? And it's got some pretty radical stuff happening, and I'll explain it. Give something back to the gamers. So Deadhaus Sonata is a narrative-driven action RPG where you play the undead fighting the living. We're starting out with a vampire class, but we're going to have liches, revenants, ghouls, banshees, wights, wraiths, very different classes, but we're also going to start to introduce the concept of different houses. So there's 9 different houses. Imagine the House of Angels or the House of Giants. And when it comes to narrative, one of the things that we did, we've been working on Deadhaus for a long time. We're a small team, totally independent, less than 10 right now. Industry's really tough. It's really brutal out there. And the idea is, what could we do with narrative that's truly different as opposed to what we did before? Because the type of narratives, when you look at, say, Eternal Darkness or Legacy of Kain, is very linear in nature, even though the games themselves can have aspects of non-linearity, but they're a linear story. You sit down in front of the TV and they come at you. So the idea was, let's create something where maybe you just playing the game changes the world around you and affects the narrative. So we have a couple things that really stand out. So and just as a preamble, while we're creating the game, we created these things called the Chronicles of the Grand Inquisitor. And it's 13 hours of audio dramas that you can listen to. They're in the game. And as we get close to early access, you'll be able to listen to them all in there. It's a ton of narrative. We probably have more narrative in the Chronicles than any of my previous games. And we haven't even started yet. We're going into early access. And they're a huge community favorite. They're really highly rated. We've been working with a group of professional voice actors, very high quality stuff. It's very good. I strongly recommend people listen to them because the voice acting and the sound effects, in my opinion, are very strong. I don't want to be tooting my own horn, but I think they're pretty cool. And we wanted to create something where narrative gets taken to the next level. A couple things that we're doing. We have a tarot card skill system. So you collect tarot cards and you can upgrade these cards. But the idea is you can only have so many cards in play at once. So say right now we have few cards and we're going to keep adding, but say you have 50 cards as a vampire, you go on a mission, you can only take 5. And you can upgrade those cards and you can customize them. There's going to be rare cards, all the things that you get with card games. So the idea is to do something different with skill systems. And if you look at a game like Diablo, our other games, I used to love the whole aspect of discovery. You're playing the game and you're discovering that this skill goes well with this skill and spin the wind works with this. And it's really fun. But then you get to level 50 and it's just like, go to the internet, get the meta. It gets really boring. With this system, if we're constantly coming up with tarot skill cards, you're just constantly in that discovery phase. That's one aspect. The other aspect of something we're doing is the RPG system is based off of quantum theory. And the best way I would describe it is we're not using random number generators in any way. So in Diablo, another example, using Diablo again, if you want that epic set, you just have to keep killing people till you get that 1% drop till you finally get it. It's a casino mechanic. It's very common. We used it for 30 years. I'm not criticizing it, but we want to do something different. Again, trying to do something innovative. Imagine a system that takes into account the entire universe as we best know it. And this is where the quantum theory goes in. You are your history. So Ilya, if I was to say to you, how can we best describe this moment in time? All the things that you've done to this date to say, I'm going to make this podcast that's going to be focused on vampires. All the things that I've done around vampires and us connecting, you connecting with me, say, hey, you want to do this podcast? And me saying, sure. That is the best definition of our universe as we know it. It's you are your history. So imagine now we start simulating planetary bodies, full moons, weather patterns, planetary alignments, days, months of the year, all of that stuff, all the things that are going on in the universe, all the other things that players are doing, all go in to determine what your loot is. Playing is crafting and history is currency. Depending on what you do, that determines what you get. You've got this history and this story, which is a natural narrative. Now imagine that we have many players doing this. And the idea is over time, we have this living, breathing universe where, yes, we tell our story. We've got a long story we want to tell with 9 houses and 10 years of planned story arcs and some really cool stuff. But the world is going to evolve and there's going to be mini stories within this grand arc of a story where players will determine what's happening. The idea is to take narrative to the next level, to tell a narrative in a story. You know, we get constant online all the time. We have co-op and multiplayer and people are like, oh my God, I thought this was going to be a single player game. And as a technology person at the same time as being someone who's created and crafted a lot of worlds, we really want to break the mold that just because something is online doesn't mean you can't have a great story, because you can. And if you look at the SCP, I don't know if you're familiar with that, Secure, Contain, and Protect, that is an experiment where thousands of writers have come together to combine and create stories that are awesome. And for those who don't know, it's kind of like X-Files meets Lovecraft. It's amazing stuff. I recommend people checking it out. There's all kinds of videos on YouTube about the SCP and stuff. It's pretty cool. So the idea was, let's create a universe where players can contribute to the story as well. So we're going to have tools for people to create their own stories and submit them and all that stuff. And then the last big thing, and this was the third thing, we want to do this very different. We're big believers in stop killing games. And at the beginning of this podcast, I said I wanted to give back to gamers. Well, one of the ways we want to give back to gamers is we're going to give the game away to the community. So over time, we're going to tell our story. We have this technology called Eternity that theoretically will allow the game to continue forever, regardless of hardware platforms. And our goal is to give the IP away, the storyline, the technology, everything to the gamers so they can control it. 200 years from now, when I'm long dead, if people still want to play Deadhaus, It'll be theirs and up to them. And if it's making money, however they're doing it, it doesn't matter. We're going to hand off the whole thing. It's one way to give back more than anything else, because I have to say, since creating Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, and it's so awesome to have someone so interested that you'd want to talk to me about a game I made 30 years ago, Our Eternal Darkness, Our Too Human. People are always saying, what about a story like this? What about a story like that? And so rather than me saying, these are really cool ideas and here's the 100 million hurdles you have to get through to even possibly make this a reality, how about I just give it to people and say, go. And if you look at really big IPs, say like Star Wars as an example, I think there's a really good argument to be made that the community are much better people to take care of that IP than the actual people who own it right now. And that's one of the things we're doing. So that's Deadhaus in a nutshell. I know it's a really long answer. It's third person, so think about it like Warframe with a really good story. Not that Warframe didn't have a good story, but we're much more narrative focused. And at the same time, you're playing the undead, so vampires, revenants, ghouls, all that cool stuff. And, lots of dialogue. So anyway, that's my summary.
I have to now choose the sequence of questions that this spawned. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were mentioning the quantum theory behind the world, when I was taking philosophy back at the university, we studied this thing called physical determinism. And as you were describing it, I was like, this is physical determinism. But the thing that then led me to think about is, well, this comes back to fatalism, and that the original idea of Legacy of Kain was like the fight. How much choice do you have and what do you do with choice? How much did that go in, and is there a threat? It feels like struggling with what is choice. It's very important to the games that you build, but it also is a very important theme to the vampire, right? The vampire, outside of the game tropes, is always struggling with how somebody became a vampire, right? How you deal with your urges, how you deal with a lot of things, and how much choice do you actually have there. So I'm going to just pause there because it kind of just sparked that analogy.
No, I think you're exactly right. And it's very interesting. And these deep philosophical questions have been around since the birth of mankind. Are we fated to do things, or do we have choice? There's a lot of very interesting things. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Have you heard about eternalism or the concept of the block universe? You have heard of these things. So I think they're super cool. I had the opportunity. I was inspired before I formed Apocalypse. I was working with a bunch of quantum physicists at the Perimeter Institute. It's where the top quantum physicists in the world gather. And I interviewed like 6 of them, and they're like really highly regarded from all over the world. They started explaining things that broke my brain, like the block universe. And just so everyone understands, the block universe in physics, and Einstein believed in this as an example, but many physicists still do. In physics, when you're calculating putting rockets up into space and in the moon, there's one variable that never comes in, and that variable is time. So the idea in the philosophy here is, well, wait a minute, if time is not a variable, then the past, present, and future are all the same. And if that's true, and you can figure out the mechanics for that, then theoretically you can go back into the past. There's no difference from the past in the present or in the future. So the block universe in some sense is quantum theory for prophecy. If you have advanced technology, you look at, say, things in like Revelation in the Bible, it could be that they had understood how the block universe worked, and they just went 30 or 22,000 years or 3,000 years in the future and said, oh, here's what happens. It's these philosophical questions that we like to explore. And Lovecraft also like this. Through the Gate with the Silver Key talks about the block universe and quantum mechanics quite a bit. I'm a huge Lovecraft fan. And I think when it comes down to telling stories of vampires and fate, and do you have control over your physiology versus your destiny? And did you have choice when you became a vampire or not? These are all sort of fundamental questions when it comes to humanity. Do our choices make a difference? And with Deadhaus, it is absolutely deterministic. But your choices make a huge difference in this deterministic world. I think those kind of deep questions are super exciting. And I hope people recognize that when they see Deadhaus Sonata and they see the celestial clock come up for the first time, and it starts saying what the date is and what the weather's like. And we've already had some feedback. We did a test with like 400 people, and some people really loved it. And some people are like, I get it, there's a clock. Can we just move on? And you can play the game whether you understand that or not. But we have had some people who try to reverse engineer to try to take control of their destiny, saying, well, wait, if I do this on a full moon and I do this here and I do X here, will I get this? And that's what we try to do with our lives in general. When you're playing the stock market or you're doing something else, you're making a bet on a sports team, even when we're trying to predict the weather, which we're really shitty at doing. You're trying to take all the facts and try to put it in a way that you can best describe it and try to make our futures as predictable as possible. So yeah, that's a huge, huge theme in Deadhaus, and I'm glad you picked up on it.
I'm very curious if you could share a little bit about the Deadhaus vampire. Unlike in a lot of other games, he lives, as you said, in the universe of other supernatural creatures. You're playing for the vampire. You don't see yourself as a bad guy. You have your own motivations. You have your own goals. So yeah, if you could share a little bit about that vampire and what his world is like.
Yeah, so mankind is in rough shape. The human empire is very close to being wiped out in Deadhaus. And we wanted to create a world that was very, very grim. So grim that some would argue better off being dead than alive. And the formation of Deadhaus is very new. It's one of the newer houses. But vampires are a sect within the entire House of the Dead. And I strongly recommend for people who really want to dive into this stuff, check out the radio plays. We talk about the different hierarchies. The king of the House of the Dead is a revenant called Nagaztak. So it's not even a vampire. And vampires have their powers, but they have to work with types of undead that have completely different motivations. And structuring all that, I love that kind of world building. How would it work? How would vampires feel compared to, say, revenants who, man, they like to fight? Where vampires are more of an aristocratic kind of group. They can look beautiful. Where revenants, they don't care. So are ghouls even deeper and different and very gory. And as a ghoul, you are what you eat, right? So we have all of these different factions within the undead. The whole idea of the House of the Dead is the House of the Dead is actually quite noble and is moving towards truth. They're trying to find out truth in the world. And they're like everyone else is trying to find their own existence, the meaning of their own existence. And all the other houses also feel the same way. As a matter of fact, we have this one episode in the Chronicles called The Prophecies. And the prophecies are, I was just talking about the block universe. Imagine where every different house would like to see the world go and how they're going to win this titanic battle that's coming. And they're all different. They all seem, fairly reasonable to a certain extent, or at least I wouldn't say fairly reasonable, but you understand their rational approaches to their viewpoint of the world. And telling a story within this universe is super fun. So the vampires themselves, the hierarchy within the undead, working all of that stuff out is, to me, it's the most fun stuff. We've been doing it for years now. We've been working on Deadhaus for a long time. I guess even that, maybe we're talking about lessons learned from Kain. I'm just like, take your time. The only thing you have to worry about as a game developer is, are you dead yet? And if you're still surviving, keep working. I've had so many people for how long we're working on stuff. They did it with Legacy of Kain. They did it with Eternal Darkness. I did it with Two Human. They're doing it with Deadhaus as well. But I don't think any of that stuff matters. I think all that matters in the end is how good is the world building? How interesting is it? And do gamers really like what they're hearing and digesting? And are you building a good world? And that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of dedication and research. So anyway, I know it's a super long answer, but that's it.
It's very interesting to hear. And I think it speaks to a lot of the artists within the community to hear, focus on just kind of building your vision, because I think a lot of the industry right now is focused on how quickly can you ship something out. And that is a metric everybody's looking at. I often try to talk to people, like, yes, it's a business, but it's also an art. It's that one of the things that sits in between these disciplines, and you can't forget about the art side of it. Otherwise, everything kind of starts to suffer and it stops feeling like you lose the soul of the world you're trying to build. It's really cool to hear that even with all of that happening, you are really going against the trend here.
Yeah. Well, I will say this. The industry has never been worse. I've been in the industry now for over 30 years. I've never seen it in worse shape. And you're absolutely right. Creativity is becoming commoditized. People like get it, ship it. In Hollywood, I heard the latest trends are these shorts on TikTok and YouTube now. They're not even talking about long form. I don't know how else to say it except if you're going to create something awesome, people hopefully will recognize it. Hopefully before you die. But at the end of the day, as creators, you have to follow your vision. And when you're creating entertainment, quite frankly, one of the golden rules that I follow is you never, ever know if you're going to create something that someone else likes. You just don't know. But what you can do as a creator is if you create something that you like, you're guaranteed to please at least one person, and that's yourself. And then on top of that, that love for your creation will come through osmosis and all of those things. So all of the little details that we put in Legacy of Kain or putting in Deadhaus Sonata or Eternal Darkness, all of these different things, there's nothing so rewarding as someone coming up to you and saying, hey, when you did that, did you mean this? And for them to be right. And you're like, yes, that's what I meant. Or even talking about determinism here, I did not expect that. That was super cool. It's a pretty advanced topic and not too many people think philosophically anymore. And I guess that's one of the main themes in Deadhaus Sonata. And, I'm still just a rat in a cage, but It really makes me scream the way our world works right now. Like, if we can't do our own taxes because tax law is too complicated, we need accountants. We can't understand our own laws because they're written by lawyers. Technology is so complex. I got two computer science degrees, one master's in AI. I don't understand all the tech. I don't pretend to, but I know way more than most people, but I still don't understand it. And to see the average person be bombarded by all these layers of complexity, it becomes impossible for the average person to function. And then you see groups of people trying to take advantage of that and just lie and gaslight people into believing certain things. And it's really easy to become angry and frustrated. And I think as much as we've developed our technologies, our laws, we've really lacked in social advancement. When I think about Deadhaus, there's a lot of things to think about, but there's the mind, the body, and the soul. We have done very little in our society to think about the soul and to think about what makes us human and what are we doing on this earth for the betterment of mankind. I just think that that's so often neglected for people to think about short-term games and gains, or, I want to be rich, or blah, blah, blah. All of these things that I think are neglected more than they should be. That's one of the things when writing Deadhaus and trying to get the story out there. I wouldn't say, I'd never like to preach to anyone people have to get their own values, but to give them an opportunity to start thinking about these conundrums that we live in modern society. So I think it's worthwhile. And it's just, in my opinion, when you tell good stories, vampires, I think, are a really good medium to do that. You have a chance to get people to think about these things and escape from the world that's so tough, and hopefully get to a position where you give them more tools to combat all these things that we have to oppose. So anyway, yeah.
I have a couple more questions and I'll do a rapid fire session with you. It's interesting that you mentioned the soul, where the vampires often portrayed as somebody without a soul, right? The message there is, maybe think about the soul. But for your world, for Deadhaus Sonata, who is the vampire? How are they made? What are they able to do? How are they different from other vampires? How are they similar from other vampires? The vampire has evolved in video games so much that they're not such a unified character anymore.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's hundreds of different vampires from countries to countries, different types. And certainly for Deadhaus Sonata, we did a ton of research. So part of the storyline is exploring that question, actually. That part has not been fully revealed, but there is a storyline, and you can hear some of this in the third season of the Chronicles of the Grand Inquisitor, where we start talking about the Red Lady, who's the first vampire. The story is very complicated. There's many houses, many different powers and magics. And we have another character coming in called the Fetid Prince, who's also a very powerful character in the universe. And this particular character is a vampire. He can shapeshift into a dragon. And I would say that's the kind of stuff that makes good storytelling. How are we different? I would say we've done a ton of research into vampire lore. We've looked at the hundreds of different mythologies, and we came up with something that made sense in our world, but that story is being told as we go. And part of understanding that, I think, is hopefully going to be a really good payoff for the gamers. It's similar to some things that are out there, but it's completely original from that standpoint. So there's all kinds of different culture and different research that you have to do for a game. And looking into anthropology and sort of the foundations of the world help things relate. Mythologies are a really good example of stories that are completely classic. They were probably iterated over years and changed over time, but they're classic in the sense that they're still popular today, and there's something that resonates with human nature. That's why we do a lot of research into these things. So the question that you're asking is out there in Deadhaus, but you have to explore it on your own and you have to figure that out. And it's, in my opinion, is very much worthwhile. But you'll have to check that out.
There's two things that I'm really excited about. Annoyed by the fact that if you look at mythology, there's a lot of lore around the female vampire. But then when you start looking a lot of even gaming and pop culture references, it's a lot of times the male vampire. Where again, if you look at across a lot of different countries, the female vampire has a lot of story around the origin and history. There's a lot of different origin stories too. The other thing that I'm very excited about is the fact that you mentioned different global mythologies. I think right now, and this is my personal pet peeve, not that I see anything particularly wrong with it, but the gaming industry has zeroed in on like three mythological, in particular myself, and I've mentioned this earlier, but I'm very quite interested in, for instance, Irish mythology, and there's a lot of interesting stories there. But there's so much written and so much there that you could work with, these worlds that exist. And as an industry, we've kind of focused on three, maybe four. I'm personally quite excited to see other mythologies seep through into this game because it brings something different. It brings something that is consistent and is tied to us over time.
It's natural. Yeah, you can relate to it. And even going back to the early days of Legacy of Kain, when I started using Futhark runes, the blood script, which most people at the time back then, no one had done that kind of research. Or if you look at things like, say, as Legacy of Kain as an example, when you're going through that time traveling element, you have the Colossus of Rhodes. That's where that idea came from, that huge statue that's being built. You first go through it to show how time is kind of like visual storytelling. The first time you go through, it's being built. The second time you go through, it's fully built. The third time you go through, it's collapsed to show the passage of time. But I remember working on it and asking people, you ever heard of the Colossus of Rhodes, like at Crystal? And they'd be like, nah, they didn't know what I was talking about. But it's that kind of research. You have to do the research. And by doing the research into the Futhark ruins or different sort of anthropology of what you're working on, that really gives you a strong foundation for that base. So we have done so much of that for Deadhaus Sonata. It's kind of terrifying, the amount of names, and I hope people have a chance to really dig into it. We've got a bunch of very, very hardcore people in the community. You know how a lot of people have sort of a rock, paper, scissors game design for things? Well, we went a little further. We created something that's called an octahedron. It's kind of like two pyramids connected at the base. So it's this, and all of the house designs and everything in them all work towards this octahedron. And I was writing a little bit of very basic poetry at the very beginning of the development, and people figured it out. They're like, this is an octahedron. I was like, whoa. When we first did the design of Deadhaus, we created a 3D octahedron, and we had like Deadhaus over here, and we had Imperium over here, which is like the House of Angels, and all of these different houses are all related in a very consistent way, but that's through years of research into anthropology and civilizations and culture and amongst the world. And it's a different world than, say, our world, but it's all based upon that stuff, so it will resonate. So hopefully that'll come through. Hopefully everyone likes it. Time will tell. We've got a big story to tell. We're going into early access. We've got a long way to go, but hopefully it goes well. And as I mentioned earlier, hopefully in the end we can, when I'm old and gray, I'll be able to just hand it off to the gamers and say, it's yours. Do with it what you like now. Tell more stories. It's a great world, and you've helped contribute to it. Make it happen.
I'll ask one more big question before I'll go to rapid fire, and I appreciate you taking the time with us. I'm curious, this is a big story, right? And I think you mentioned earlier in the podcast, the way people consume stories has changed, and everything around us is pushing us towards short form content.
Right.
And something that gives me pause, it's not that it's just short, it's summarized, right? And so the more we try to condense things, the more we lose nuance. And it feels like people are having a harder time ingesting long form content. The world that you're creating does not lean towards summarization. It requires to be explored and taken time with in order to appreciate all of the nuances. How do you get people into that right now, given that, attention spans are going down, given that they just consume simpler content, not just shorter content? It's just simpler. So what do you do? How do you get them excited and spending the effort?
Sure. Well, two things. One is to keep an undaunting faith in humanity that spending time on this stuff will make a difference. But the other is allowing people to consume this content in small bites. So can you come in to Deadhaus and play it for like 10 or 15 minutes? Yeah. Can you get a bit of a story out of it? For sure. Do you want to dig? Well, it's a deep rabbit hole. It's a very deep rabbit hole. And some would say calling it a rabbit hole is the wrong word. It could be a tunnel that goes down 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 feet. So like as an example, some of the stories we're telling in Deadhaus go back like 25,000 years before the game starts. And if people want to dig for that stuff, they can. But if you just want to get in and play and get out, you can as well. A good friend of mine once said to me, when you're designing a game, I guess you want it to be like a carnival where people can run around and explore things, or a theme park where they can go on the Ferris wheel, or they can try this. They can just try things out that they want to do. And if you leave the content out there for them to explore, there's going to be some people that are like, I just love vampires. I want to dig into the vampire stuff. There could be other people that are like, well, what's this Banshee all about? Or what's Imperium like? What's the house? What is this house called Imperium, and what are they all about? And what are these, angel looking things? And we also have other things like the House of the Mind, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff out there. And the idea is to give them this place to explore and play in and let them do it. And if you make it in such a way that you can enjoy the game with small chunks, but at the same time provide this huge background, that's we hope we can do it. As an example, the radio plays are on Spotify, but they're also in the game. And, playing the game with your friends in co-op, you can do that, or you can just jump in and just dig into the lore, do research, do whatever. The idea is that we want to give people that ability to explore as much as they can. That's my answer to that. I don't know if it's going to be effective. I don't know. I hope so. Time will tell.
So I'm really hoping that we'll do this more than once because I have so many other questions, but I do want to move to the few short questions we kind of try to ask everybody. What is your favorite vampire story, legend, myth?
It's a tough one. I guess classically would be Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think it's still one of the best stories. It's very interesting, but there's just so much out there. So I guess if I had to pick one, I'd pick that, but there's like a million things out there that I think are very interesting and cool. Yeah, let's just leave it there. But like I said, when we were starting Deadhaus, we started researching just vampires alone and found out there were hundreds of different vampires. One where corpses split off and the top, intestines are flying out as these vampires are flying around trying to get food, and it is pretty fun. I guess I would stick with Bram Stoker's. I'd go classic.
What is your favorite vampire game or a recent vampire game that you really like that's not your game?
It's interesting. I don't know if I have one. I can't think of one that I was just like, wow, that was awesome being a vampire. I love vampire stuff, but I can't really put my finger on one. There's a lot of good vampire games out there, but nothing that just sort of really resonates and goes, yeah, that's it. Sorry.
No, that's all right. What is your favorite vampire special ability?
Oh, there's so many special abilities. I love the illusion stuff. I love the possession stuff. I guess I loved all the things we did with Blood Omen. In some ways, I guess we really expanded the pool of what a vampire could do, but we just assumed that a vampire was very strong in his abilities with magic. Some would argue it's blood magic, but I think we took it beyond that even. I guess innately, if I was to pick one, is ability to self-sustain by feeding on other people's blood, but that's what a vampire is. Always that exchange.
It's interesting that in a lot of, especially pop culture references right now, vampires are often pitted against magic, like witches and Wiccan type creatures, whereas you've actually given vampires the ability to hold magic, to be magical creatures themselves, which is very cool. It goes against the current very narrow view of who has to match up against who. But I just find that very cool. What is your favorite vampire movie or TV show?
Bram Stoker's way up there. It wasn't an awesome movie per se, but what was that one where they told the story of Dracula, but he was close to Kain in some ways because he had all these powers? Was it Dracula Untold or something? It was a more recent one. That was kind of fun. As far as Marvel movies go, my favorite Marvel movie is Blade. I love Blade. I thought it was really cool. And it does have the daylight thing in there, but there's an example, in my opinion, of a vampire using cool stuff. That's why I liked it so much. I really like Blade as well. I love a ton of vampire movies. I could go on forever. Kronos was really cool. The latest Nosferatu was fantastic. I love a lot of movies. I watch movies all the time. And a good friend of mine, retired professor from the local university, used to run the film and popular culture. We go see horror films every weekend. So we're big into horror and we've seen a lot of vampire movies.
My last question for today is, where do you stand on fate versus choice? Or, you can say existentialism versus fatalism, but for your particular vampires, it feels like it's an important question. Where do you stand on it as their maker?
My answer to that would be, as human beings, we have to explore that and figure it out ourselves. So rather than give an answer, I would say create a world where people can explore that and find out what they think is the answer. Is it deterministic? Are we destined to do what we're going to do, or do we have choice? I think they're great questions, but I don't like telling people. I think they should explore it on their own.
Just a little bit. They'll be able to in Deadhaus Sonata. So for those of you listening, Deadhaus Sonata is going into early access in just a little bit. If you enjoyed the philosophical discussions, you can go grab a sword and go figure things out for yourself. Dennis, thank you so much for joining Bite and Play. It was really awesome to have this conversation and talk about your vampires. Hopefully we'll get to do it again. Everybody, this was Bite and Play. Thank you so much.